Hello, and welcome to Esther's Gardening Adventures. I'm Esther, and today I'm going to talk about 10 mistakes to avoid when you're winter sowing. If this is your first time hearing about winter sowing, please check out my Winter Sowing 101 series where I break down everything you need to know from what it is to all the steps involved, all the materials you need. But in a nutshell, it is basically the process for growing your seedlings for your spring and summer garden, growing them over the winter in things like milk jugs outside versus indoors under grow lights. All right, so let's get to the first mistake. Seed starting mix is good for what it sounds like, starting seeds, but it does not have compost and other nutrients in it to make sure those seeds have what they need to be able to continue growing past the point of sprouting. That every plant grows a set of seed leaves, and those leaves basically have nutrients in them to feed the plant until it can grow its set of first true leaves, the leaves that will look like the plant for the rest of its life. And so you need something to feed the plant once those seed leaves run out of energy. If you were growing a seedling indoors, you could transplant that plant from the seed starting mix into a potting soil that had more nutrients. But instead, you're basically putting everything you need for the entire seed growing process in that jug. And so what you want to use is potting mix or potting soil. Preferably organic, just because plants tend to be healthier when you go organic, but that is a personal choice. As for which potting mix to pick, if you've watched one of my recent videos where I basically tried testing out some premium potting soils versus less expensive ones that were both organic, I had a hard time seeing a huge difference. I do think you can have healthier plants if you use premium mix, but if you're in a pinch or you just really don't want to budget that amount of money for the premium mix, spending a little bit less on a potting mix is going to be okay. So if you were growing your seeds indoors under grow lights, you would normally look at the seed package, the envelope, and see what it says for when to start, which is usually like a certain amount of weeks, let's say 2 to 4 weeks before your average last frost date. And the reason being is your house is warm enough that those seeds will start sprouting, will have the trigger to start sprouting pretty much immediately after you plant them. Whereas with winter sowing, it's a completely different process. It's not intuitive in the same way. Basically, you want to plant your seeds. You want to start the winter sowing at the time of year when your coldest temperatures are consistent, when your winter has consistently the most cold temperatures. You don't want huge fluctuations in warm temperatures and then cold temperatures, because it could prompt plants to prematurely sprout, and then you would basically have to make sure they survive through all the big winter frosts and other things that are coming until you can transplant them. And it's just stressful on the plants, it's stressful on you. There's no real need to cause yourself that stress. So as a general rule, I recommend, and a lot of the people I talk with recommend, starting your winter sowing around February. So February to mid-April is sort of like the perfect window for winter sowing. There is one exception to this. It's if you're growing plants that need something called cold stratification or winter stratification. And the idea is that these are seeds that need a certain period of continuous cold days in order for their genetics to allow them to start germinating when it gets warm. For those seeds, you can start them a little bit earlier, and I am going to do a video that goes into great more detail about that. Now, let me be clear. If you are just doing a vegetable garden, or you're growing fruit, or you're growing just your basic standard annual or even perennial flowers, chances are very high that you don't have to worry about cold stratification or winter stratification. Filling your jugs with soil early. So you absolutely should be prepping your milk jugs and other containers now. You should be drilling holes in them. You should be making sure they're clean. You make sure you have enough. Make sure you have the materials, the potting mix, and the pens, and the whatever you plan to cut the jugs with. Make sure you have everything on hand now. But don't start filling up your jugs with potting mix weeks to months in advance of when you're actually going to put the seeds in and put them outside. There's a couple of reasons for this. I see people do this because they want to get ahead. They want to be ready. They're so excited. They want to do something. But the problem is your potting mix needs to be very damp when you put the seeds in them and put them outside. And you need to do that immediately as soon as you assemble everything. If you're filling your pots now, you're basically going to have to take extra steps to get that potting mix completely thoroughly wet again before you put the seeds in and seal the jugs up and put them out. And to me, that just seems like extra work. I just generally think it's a better idea to assemble it all at one time. Now you can do them in sets, you can do them a little bit at a time, but don't fill up your jugs weeks in advance of doing the whole process. This is something I discovered after my first year in winter sowing. And what that means is you do not want to have multiple seeds growing in the same spot because their roots will be intertwined, they'll be competing for nutrients, and it'll just stress them more. So if you can plant one seed per hole, that is the best option. If you really can't resist planting the equivalent of 2 per hole, and you can plant seeds next to each other in a hole, like tiny bit apart, meaning, you know, I know one of these 2 is going to sprout. But really, even then, when I tried that, just about every seed sprouted. So I do recommend 1 seed per hole. If you learn anything from this video, learn this one. Pretty much you need at least 4 inches of potting mix, of moistened potting mix, not unmoistened, because unmoistened potting mix will be a lot bigger. Once it's moistened, it's a lot more dense. So you need at least 4 inches, not necessarily more, but 4 inches of potting mix in your container. For me, this means if you have your average milk jug here, right? It means if you cut it right about where the handle is, I probably should have cut this a tiny bit higher, you should be having about 4 inches total, and about 1 inch per knuckle, right? So if I go from the ground, that goes all the way up to the top. So that's about 1, 2, 3, that's about 4 inches. I'll probably put a little bit more in this one. Less than that risks 2 things. One, not giving the seedlings enough space for their roots to grow. Now, some seedlings don't need long roots, or you're gonna transplant them relatively early. Like my kale, I transplant them pretty shortly after they've sprouted, by the time they put up their second set of leaves, and their roots don't get super deep. But some plants need deep roots, and so you want to make sure you have at least 4 inches for that. Another reason to have 4 inches is it decreases the risk of the soil drying out too fast. It helps retain moisture, and it helps make sure that the plants are healthy and doing well. I'm going to use these pelleted carrot seeds as an example. I'm not planning on actually growing these, so I'm just using this for demonstration purposes. This is some free seeds I got from Baker Creek. Okay, so when you're planting your seeds, you don't want to plant them too deep. You want to just push them in just a little bit into the soil, just a tiny, tiny bit. And you can cover them up. And then the second layer is, and if you watch my videos, you'll see more on this, but then you take some additional potting mix and you do a very light layer over the top. Just enough to cover it. So you're gonna have a very small amount. And for smaller seeds, you may even just wanna sprinkle them on the top and then just put a thin layer on top. Or some of the very smallest seeds, they recommend just sprinkling on the top because they need light to germinate. What you want to avoid doing is planting the seeds too deep. You want to avoid digging a hole that's like, you know, down to the first knuckle, that's a whole inch, and putting it in. You really don't want to plant your seeds too deep, and often the failure of your seeds to sprout is the fact that they have been planted too deep in your winter sowing jug. Another mistake you don't want to make is not paying enough attention to your containers, to your jugs. Now, once your seeds start sprouting, Lord help you if you won't check your containers at least 3 times a day. But while you're waiting for the seeds to sprout, it's easy to forget about the containers and not check them. And you do want to check them regularly. I'd say at least once a week. And definitely, if you're going to have a big freeze or a big frost, definitely check the containers, especially the ones for frost-hardy plants that are most likely to sprout in colder temperatures. Check the containers to see if you see any seedlings have sprouted above the soil. Because if they have sprouted, then you need to Cover them overnight during those freezing temperatures. Only if it's freezing outside. You don't need to cover your containers any other time. And only if they've sprouted. Don't cover containers that have no seeds that have sprouted. Another reason you want to check your containers frequently, at least once a week, is to make sure that they have adequate water levels. So this will help you keep control of pests, be aware of what you need to change, be aware of how to take care of the containers, and also it's just fun to monitor the containers, I think. I think it's just fun to check them regularly. All right, we're down to the last two things not to do, the last two mistakes to avoid. One is not having proper drainage. I like to give this example here. I'm prepping one of my jugs now. You can also watch my winter sowing video on how to prepare your jugs. But basically, you want to do 3 holes per sort of section if you're doing like a milk jug. Also don't want to forget to drill holes in the sides of the container as extra insurance of proper drainage. You want to check your jugs and make sure you see water coming out of them on rainy days or when you water them if you do end up watering them once they're outside. Because if they have improper drainage, the plants will drown and or will get more moldy than normal. Now, the winter sowing process, basically those milk jugs are mini greenhouses. So you're going to have a little bit of green, a little bit of algae form in those containers, but you shouldn't have mass amounts of mold, and you should keep an eye on that. And if you don't have proper drainage, it can be a big problem for your winter sowing. The last mistake to avoid, and this is so hard to do, but it's a really important one, is to not get frustrated by how others are doing or compare how your seedlings are doing compared to how you're used to it going when you grow them inside under grow lights. Seedlings that are grown using the winter sowing process can sometimes be a little bit longer before they sprout. That's because they're waiting for the natural signal from the outdoors to let them know when it's safe to sprout versus indoors where you keep it warm all the time. So your tomato seedlings are going to be smaller in the container for most of the time than you would see at the big box store, which, by the way, they use all kinds of tricks and tools to get their plants to sprout earlier anyway. And also, it's going to be different than people in other zones and other regions from you. The most important thing is to make sure that your containers and your seedlings are looking healthy when they do sprout, that you're maintaining your plants, and when you do transplant them, you will be surprised at how fast they catch up and overtake the size of anything else you've transplanted. People often comment that the plants are small when they plant them, the seedlings are small when they transplant them outside. And then within a few weeks, they're twice the height or twice the size of the ones they bought from the big box store. So you just need to be patient and trust the process. And don't be frustrated when you go to the big box store and see tall tomato plants or other types of seedlings, or when you see other people posting in gardening and winter sowing Facebook groups when your plants aren't doing the same. Everybody has their own microclimates. Everybody has their own process. And I say just celebrate with the people who are having success. Just be happy for them and looking forward to when you get to have your own pictures and knowledge to share. All right, so that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found these tips helpful. If there were any I didn't mention that you thought maybe should be included on the list, I'd love to hear your comments or suggestions. And if you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you aren't already a subscriber, please consider doing so. And if you are a subscriber, please make sure you have the bell set so you get alerts when I post new content so you don't miss out on good stuff coming up. All right, see you next time.